was, quote, miraculously, unquote, taken from the side of Adam on the same sixth day when Adam was in, quote, a locked sleep. If Eve was miraculously made, then she was made in one day. Moreover, it would be logical to assume that Pope Leo meant that Adam was miraculously made, for he offered no hint of a distinction between the creation of Adam and the creation of Eve. If Leo thought there was an evolutionary distinction in their respective appearances, then it is reasonable to assume he would have mentioned it. Without it, Leo's silence is deafening against theistic evolution. Knowing the insurmountable problems Eve causes for theistic evolution, in 1932, one Catholic theologian, J. Paque, proposed that Adam and Eve were twins from the same immediate ancestor. The 1909 Biblical Commission. Now this brings up an interesting point. In the midst of the dissent and discussion about evolution that the Church has allowed until the present day, the Biblical Commission of 1909, which at that time was an authoritative body of the Church, stated that the Hebrew word yom, that is day, which is the English word day, in Genesis 1, could be taken, quote, either in its strict sense as the natural day, or in a less strict sense as signifying a certain space of time, unquote. Why did the Commission allow the less strict sense as well as the strict sense? Not necessarily because they were advocating evolution, or that a day in Genesis could comprise millions of years, but simply because Scripture sometimes uses the Hebrew word yom in a figurative sense, or as an indefinite period of time. For example, in Isaiah 4:2 it says, "In that day the branch of the Lord will be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the earth will be the adornment of the survivors of Israel." Obviously, this passage is suggesting more than a 24-hour period for the word day, since the Lord's glory is to go on indefinitely. Or take the oft-quoted passage in 2 Peter 3, verse 8, with "the Lord a day is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day." Now, mind you, this passage is not saying that 1,000 years is a day, since the Greek word hos limits the meaning to the Lord's perspective of time, who does not grow weary or impatient, and thus to him 1,000 years is metaphorically like a day, and vice versa. Here's another fact about the Hebrew word yom. Whenever yom is used with an ordinal number in Scripture, it never refers to an indefinite or long period of time. In Genesis 1, there are 6 ordinal numbers which are enumerated: the first day, the second day, the third day, and so on to the 6th day. In contrast, in Genesis 2:4, the word day does not have an ordinal number attached to it, which would eliminate it from comparison to Genesis 1 and thus vindicate our interpretation. If the Hebrews wanted to leave no question that the word yom, that is day, meant an indefinite period of time, such that it desired to convey long ages of process and change, it had very suitable ways to do so in the Hebrew language. It could use the plural, yamim, as it does in Genesis 1:14 or 3:14. It could have connected yom with other words of indefiniteness, such as dor, olam, netzach, tami, or any of a dozen similar Hebrew words and concepts. But the Hebrew of Genesis 1 chose none of these possibilities. Rather, it chose the most specific phrase for a 24-hour day that one can find in the Hebrew Scriptures. Now let's reflect back on the 1909 Biblical Commission statement that day could be interpreted literally or figuratively. Notice the Commission did not specify that the word day in Genesis 1 must or should be interpreted in a less than strict way, but only that the Hebrew word for yom in Scripture could have such a meaning. In light of the other Scriptures we have pointed out that use the word day in an indefinite sense, the Commission had no choice but to affirm that the Hebrew word yom could sometimes be translated figuratively or as an indefinite period of time. In fact, there are 5 different ways the Hebrew word yom is used in Scripture. But whether the Commission was teaching that yom in Genesis 1 is to be understood as an indefinite period of time comprising millions of years, they did not say. Indeed, every indication we have shows that they did not intend to suggest that Yom in Genesis 1 was figurative, since just 30 years earlier, Pope Leo XIII had stated that God made Eve miraculously from the side of Adam on the sixth day, a period of time which would have comprised 24 hours from sunset to sunrise. The evening and morning sequence. The most conclusive evidence that the word day in Genesis 1 is to be interpreted as a 24-hour period is confirmed by the consistent use of the phrase, quote, "and there was evening and morning," unquote, in each of the days of creation. When we examine the specific phrase, evening and morning, in Scripture, we see that it always refers to the sequence of darkness and light comprising a single period of a day, a 24-hour period. Exodus 16:8-13, Exodus 27:21, Exodus 29:39, Leviticus 24:3, Numbers 9:21, Daniel 8:26. As opposed to the many times in Scripture that the words morning or evening appear separately with the word day, some of which refer to a literal solar day and some of which are indefinite of time, the specific phrase, "and there was evening and there was morning," the first day, second day, third day, never refers to a figurative or indefinite length of time in Scripture. In light of this information, notice that the 1909 Biblical Commission never said that the phrase evening and morning could be taken in an improper or figurative sense, since Scripture never offered them any cases in which that phrase was used in such a way. Evening and morning is very specific, and as such, it is used less than a dozen times in Scripture, unlike the Hebrew word for day, which is used over 2,000 times in Scripture. There is a general rule in hermeneutics that the less frequently a word or phrase is used, the more specialized is the meaning of that word or phrase. We add to this the fact that the unique phrase evening and morning is ascribed to the day that Adam became a man and his soul was infused. We have already seen how Scripture uses the phrase evening and morning. It refers to a single sequence of darkness and light comprising one day. That day begins when Adam becomes a man with a soul, whether you're a theistic evolutionist or an ex nihilo creationist. And for both views, it must end when the 24-hour day ends. Since there are no other creation events occurring after Adam, then it follows that the evening morning of Genesis 1:31 is speaking about one actual day, a period of darkness to a period of light. That the evening and morning of Genesis 1:31 is speaking of one day of 24 hours becomes even clearer when we understand that Eve's creation, which, according to church teaching, cannot come from evolution, but miraculously from the side of Adam, means that the theistic evolutionist must admit that, whatever they believe about Adam's creation, Eve was created instantaneously, and thus she was created in a single day. Since Genesis 1:31 puts Eve's creation within the time frame of the evening and morning, we again have confirmation that the sixth day of creation was an evening and morning of 24 hours. And so, any conscientious biblical exegete must conclude that if in Genesis 1:31 evening and morning can only refer to a sequence of darkness and light, that is one day, then by the principle of exegetical reciprocity, he must also interpret the other 5 uses of evening and morning in Genesis 1 as referring to a single sequence of darkness and light, one day, since all